Hello, this is Chapter 7 of Organizational Behavior. We're going to cover basically just the PowerPoint and go through it, so the makeup for the class that was canceled, I believe, on March 12th. There will be subsequent videos that will also be on Chapters 11 and 12, and eventually we'll try to get going so that we can put courses up live. If that doesn't work, I can continue to do the YouTube videos. I don't know if everybody has access to everything, so we're trying to figure it all out. But in the meantime, I want to make sure that you have access to the information so that we can keep the semester going. We're going to cover Chapter 7 in this Organizational Behavior and Design session. If you go to Slide 2, Chapter 7 covers trust, justice, and ethics. Trust is the willingness to put yourself in a position of vulnerability because of expectations about how another person or an entity may act. Trust is different than risk because trust is willing to put yourself into a vulnerable situation, and the risk is actually doing it. So if I trust that my computer is not going to crash, I will use it while I'm trying to make this presentation. My trust is probably misplaced because it has crashed a couple of times already, and I've had to redo this recording. So maybe my trust was misplaced. However, being willing to take the risk is what trust is all about. The risk is the possibility that something could go wrong or put yourself in a position where you could suffer some type of loss. In my case, time. Slide 4 just gives an overview of what we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides. Disposition, cognition, and affect-based trust. What this basically comes down to is disposition is related to your personality. Are you just inclined to trust people or things as a part of your nature? Cognition related to thinking, anything related to your evaluation of someone's ability, whether or not they have bad intentions, whether they have integrity, that they're going to do the right thing. Affect-based trust is simply your personal feelings towards an entity or a person, typically based on experience. And it can be a combination of what your trust propensity is plus your cognitive abilities to interpret the situation and figure out if you want to have trust in someone. Slide 5, we talk about, again, just trust propensity. This is kind of tied to your personality a little bit, and it's really based on expectation. If you believe that something is going to work because that's just kind of your nature, whether you're willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt, that relates to trust propensity. Propensity is simply the likelihood that you're going to believe or do something. So the question on slide 5 is, which is more damaging in organizational life, being too trusting or being too suspicious? Again, this is highly related to personality. Some people, you may call them naive or gullible. They may be willing to believe practically anything that they hear. Hopefully you remember our critical thinking from the beginning of the class. You'll be able to apply some cognition in there as well as we move forward. But some people typically just enter into a situation. Some will be more trusting than others, and that's really just related to your personal propensity. You can test your trust propensity on slide 6 with another one of these surveys, 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. They did a poll and they did a survey just to get people figure out how they would interpret others or other situations in terms of their propensity to trust. The way these questions are worded, the number that you end up with would probably show that you have a low propensity to trust. So for example, the first question is, one should be very cautious with strangers. If you strongly agree with that, the number that you're going to get at the end of this when you do the average is going to indicate that you don't really have a high propensity to trust someone. So the numbers are a little bit backwards if you're looking at a great level of trust or a low level of trust in terms of propensity. Experts tell the truth about the limits of their knowledge. We kind of talked about experts before. Maybe they're honest about it, maybe they're not. Most people can be counted on to do what they say they'll do. These days, you have to be alert that somebody's going to be taking advantage of you. The average of these scores, which could have been a high of 40, is about a 21, which is about halfway, so it's neutral. What that means is the people who participated in this survey come right down pretty much in the middle. They're not super trustful, they're a little bit wary. The score is basically right in the middle. Slide 7 talks about cognition-based trust. That's really whether or not you think someone is trustworthy based on the characteristics of that person. A trustee is someone that you trust. A trustor, if you're going to make it sound like a legal term, that would be you if you trust someone else. The trustee is the person or the entity that you are putting that trust in. Typically, Because this is cognition, we're talking about your mental review and your comprehension and analysis. So if you're looking at another or an entity's ability to do something, that may foster trust. You may believe that someone can be trustworthy because they can do what they are required to do. They can do what you are trusting that they will do. If they are benevolent, meaning that they don't have any bad intentions, that they're not trying to cheat you, they're not trying to lie, they're not trying to steal, based on past performance or past behaviors, you can analyze that and feel that they are benevolent, and then you would be more likely to trust them. If they also exhibit integrity, that they are not, again, it's related to benevolence, but integrity is actually demonstrating that you do the right thing, that you can be trusted, that you are conscientious, to use another term that we'll cover in the next chapter. Slide 8 is just kind of a recap of the general principles here that we're looking at, the factors that influence trust levels. Disposition-based trust, cognition trust, or affect-based trust are the three key pieces here that lead to propensity. Disposition is related by your personal willingness or unwillingness to trust someone. That's related to your personality. Again, the cognition trust is based on your processes and analysis, one's ability, benevolence, or integrity that we just discussed. And then again, affect-based trust is just how you feel towards someone. If you have a personal relationship or an ongoing relationship with a person or an entity, you may just have developed based on cognition and your disposition whether or not you should trust someone. It's more based on feeling, and it can override cognition because it is really based on your subjective feelings towards someone. You may have some red lights going off in your head thinking, well, they didn't display trustworthy behavior, maybe I shouldn't trust them. But subjectively, you have an emotional response that may even override that, and you end up trusting someone, even if you think that might not be a good idea. Slide 9, the types of trust that we're talking about, whether it's disposition, cognition, or affect-based trust, that can change over time. So when you first meet someone, you really don't have anything to go on. You don't have any subjective feelings other than really superficial things from when you first meet them. You haven't really been able to think about anything because you have no evidence yet. So it's really going to be based on your disposition. Are you a trusting person? Are you a suspicious person? That's going to come right away. Cognition is when you develop some interaction with them and you can start to evaluate it and you can think about whether this person should be trusted. That's a lot of relationships, whether it be personal or professional, with an individual or with an organization. Over time, if you have a very close relationship, then you can start to get into the subjective thing where it's more of an emotional and it's based more on history. You may give someone the benefit of the doubt, even if you think they're displaying behaviors that may not really lead you to believe that you should be trusting them. But because you have a long period of time to evaluate their performance and their responses, you may believe that you're just going to give them the benefit of the doubt. That is affect-based trust. Slide 10 establishes the key factors when you're considering justice. Justice itself is kind of a conclusion you can draw whether you're being treated fairly. The factors that go into the perception of justice include distributive justice, procedural justice, interpersonal justice, and informational justice. Slide 11 kind of breaks down the first two, distributive and procedural justice. Distributive justice, in one sense, is kind of your review about how people are allocated goods or services or rewards. So if you're talking about distributive justice as a member of an organization, you're going to be looking at whether or not people are receiving what they should be getting, what they deserve to get. If I work hard, do I get the rewards for it? If somebody's working less hard than me, are they getting the same level of reward? If not, then I could perceive that there would be injustice in terms of distribution because it's not being allocated equitably. Procedural justice in law, we would call due process. Due process is simply, I know I say never to define something with the same term, but it is the process that is due to you, that you are owed. If someone takes you to court and they sue you, you don't automatically have to pay them money. You have the opportunity to be heard. You can respond to the lawsuit. You can go into court. You can make your argument. They'll make their argument, and then an independent arbiter of justice will make a decision. By following procedure, you have a better opportunity to have justice be exercised. While due process is key in the legal world, it is also very important in organizational behavior and an entity that has due process capabilities is going to be perceived as more fair and therefore more just. Procedural justice rules include voice, whether or not you have the opportunity to give input, correctability, whether or not you can say that this is wrong, that you can have an appeal. Again, in the legal system, if you go to court and the decision comes down and you don't think it's fair, you have the ability to appeal it to a higher level court. That may be true as well for a business. If your boss does something that you don't like, there may be some way that you can ask for someone else to review. Correcting a mistake leads to a perception of justice, or the ability to correct a mistake leads to an enhanced perception that the process that you're going through is in fact just. Consistency refers to whether or not you are being treated the same as everybody else. Whatever rules there are they being applied appropriately and consistently to everybody? If you do something good, will you get the same reward every single time you do it? And will it be the same that anyone else in your position would get if they behaved in the same way? That works for negative consequences as well. If you do something wrong, will you face punishment that would be the equivalent of someone else doing the same thing? Or will you be treated more leniently or more severely? Whenever there's any gaps in consistency, there is a perception that the process is not just. In order to have a just process, there should be an effort to retain or suppress bias. Again, we talked about this at the beginning of the year with critical thinking. The key is to try to limit bias in terms of decision making or the way that you behave with others. There is a likelihood that a lot of people have biases that they're not even aware of, so we've discussed that before. If you can eliminate some type of pre-existing preference for one person or one process over another, then the justice of the situation will be perceived as being higher. In law, for example, the way that you limit bias is to give the opportunity to the other side to point out flaws in your argument. Certain evidence may not be admissible because it would be seen as being prejudicial or overly influencing bias against one party. Representativeness means, do the procedures that we have in place in our organization satisfy what everybody needs? Are they going to have the opportunity to have their concerns considered? And then accuracy is key too, because if you're making an argument and you're using bad information, or if somebody's making an argument against you and the information is false or inaccurate, that would be a problem because you're not going to get a just response if it's based on bad information. Almost all of these things we covered with critical thinking. So again, just remember back to the very beginning of the semester. Slide 12 covers another survey regarding procedural justice. Again, this is related to that due process concept. So when they ask people, are the procedures that you have moral and ethical? The grades that you get in terms of a classroom, can you appeal them? Can you talk to the professor? Can you go to the dean, for example, if you had to? They're based on accurate information. They're just asking all those same things. 7 questions with a scale of 1 to 5 means that the highest score could possibly be a 35. On the survey, it came back as 27, which is largely about a 4. So most people would agree that the situation that they were in when they answered this particular survey was inclined to show that there was procedural justice available. Slide 13 is a chart where they've graphed reactions to authority in situations where there's low procedural justice and high procedural justice. So if you look at the green line, even if you believe that there isn't a high level of procedural justice, that you don't have the opportunity to appeal and all of that, if your belief is that you got what you deserved, you're not going to be complaining about it even if there isn't any procedural justice. However, if there is procedural justice provisions afforded, then your reaction to authority is going to be less negative. So if you look at the red line, if you have a bad grade or if you get a bad review at the job and there's low procedural justice, you're not going to be particularly happy. But even if you get a bad level of reward, if there's a high level of procedural justice, the perception is that the outcome is more just. That's why the 2 points to the right are almost connected. There's a huge gap when you're lacking procedural justice because the distributive justice without any authority to go and pursue an appeal makes you feel more dissatisfied. Even if you get a bad grade or a bad outcome, if you have that opportunity to be heard, that due process, the outcome, even if it's against you, is still considered to be just. Slide 14 talks about interpersonal and informational justice. Interpersonal justice has to do with your perceptions of how you're being treated. Interpersonally means from person to person. So if people treat you with respect, if they treat you with propriety, if they treat you properly, that would create a high level of interpersonal justice and make the process seem to be more just. Informational justice is simply being able to get the information that you're required to feel confident that the situation is going forward correctly. Informational justice relates to how adequate the information that you're given, how quickly you get it, is it timely, and is it true? So again, both the way people treat you and the information that they provide you, they all go together in terms of your perception as whether or not a situation is just. Slide 15 is a graph that shows the results of interpersonal and informational justice if it's handled correctly. In terms of a process, it doesn't really take a lot to be able to implement informational and interpersonal justice. It just takes time and effort. You can see on the chart, on the left-hand column, it's the average rate of employee theft, meaning that they're stealing office supplies or even embezzling money. And then this is in response to a pay cut. So at the bottom, it's before the pay cut, during the pay cut, and after the pay cut. The blue line is just kind of a control. If there's no pay cut, the level of theft, which unfortunately is always something, doesn't really fluctuate all that much. If you have a long, sincere explanation for the pay cut, if you're treating people appropriately and you give them the information that they need, they're not going to be super happy about it, but they're not going to act out in terms of some type of perceived revenge by taking something from the company in order to compensate for the pay cut. In contrast, take a look at the red line, which is probably more than double, or at least about double what it would be in a pay cut if you don't treat people well and you don't give them the information. It tends to result in resentment, and the type of behavior would be in terms of retribution to try to steal stuff from you. So that's kind of a pretty clear, obvious way to see the benefits of just treating people well and giving them the information that they need. Slide 16, we're going to talk about ethics. And again, justice and ethics kind of play into each other. Most laws that are in the books right now came from an ethical code or a moral code. If you don't think that it's fair to steal from someone, yeah, you could be viewed as a bad person, but they passed laws also that prevent you from stealing, so there could be punishment on it. So there's a close association between ethics and law. They're not always the same. If I don't return a phone call, I may not be, morally or ethically a good person for that particular incident, but I'm not going to go to jail because of it. So there are different, it's kind of a sliding scale in terms of the spectrum of the severity of what's going on. In terms of ethics, the things that we would hope for is to avoid unethical behavior. You could have merely ethical behavior where people are just kind of getting by with the bare minimum. And then you have really ethical behavior where people take an effort to show that they are treating people fairly with morality and with ethics. Slide 17 is something that you can review. It's probably in your book as well. It's just showing the association between being aware of morality, having a moral judgment, acting with a moral intent, and therefore behaving ethically. You need to be aware of what the rules are. That's the awareness part. You need to be able to make a judgment as to whether or not your actions are going to be moral or not. Then you have to act with the intent, or you have to want to do it, and then you actually behave that way. So it's a fairly straightforward illustration. Slide 18 is another survey, so you can take a look at that. Some of the questions I think are probably not worded correctly for this particular method of scoring, but you can take a look through it just to see what type of things people consider in terms of whether or not you are paying attention to morality and ethics. Slide 19 shows the dimensions of moral intensity. What you're looking at first is whether or not the behavior that you're pondering could actually harm someone. So you look at the magnitude of consequences. If I do something, what type of an impact, good or bad, could it have on people? If I do something, what likelihood is there to be that the effect will occur and that the outcomes could possibly happen? Temporal immediacy. Temporal means tempo. It's related to time. So we're talking about how much time will pass between the action or potentially even inaction and the consequence of those choices. The final one is the concentration of effect. Am I going to affect a whole lot of people in terms of concentration, meaning a lot? Is it a dense number of people, or is it only a few people will be affected? People make these types of calculations very frequently when you're talking about the potential for harm. If I do something that maybe potentially considered to be immoral. If it's a lower magnitude, if it's unlikely to result in problems for other people, if it may be deferred in time and it only affects one or two people, you may be more likely to be encouraged to take action that may be considered unethical. So these are the considerations, the thought processes that people often go through. Another dimension is social pressure. So you look at social consensus. This is basically peer pressure. Do all of your friends, do all of your peers believe that the action that is being contemplated is ethical or not ethical? And then proximity is just how near you are to people, either literally, physically, or just emotionally, in terms of how they may be affected by the decision that you're making. So if you're looking at the previous slide, they talked about moral attentiveness. The intensity is related not just to paying attention to it, but really kind of doing a relative assessment. All of the stuff on this slide talks about making a judgment call. You might be willing to make an unethical decision if you feel that the consequences of doing so, or the likelihood of there being a bad effect, would be limited. Just going to skip over slide 20. We'll move to slide 21, where they talk about correlations again. So the effects of trust on performance and commitment. If you look at the association between trust and job performance, there's a moderate correlation. So it is beneficial to have trust in terms of how people perform. But the real correlation that's strong is the correlation between trust and organizational commitment. If your employees believe that they are working for a just employer, that they are going to be treated fairly, they are more likely to be committed to the organization, which could probably help their job performance a little bit, but it would also mean that they were going to stick around and you would have less turnover and therefore become more efficient. So in some level, simply being a trustworthy organization that pursues justice can help pay off in terms of profit at the end. Slide 22 talks about the application of all of these concepts. So corporate social responsibility, what we're talking about here, when they say corporate, it doesn't necessarily mean only corporations. They're just talking about commercial businesses, companies that are operating in the public domain. So they have a legal component, an ethical component, and a social component. We kind of already talked about the legal component a bit before. Some of them are required. A lot of the laws, as we noted, came from ethics, and they've been actually written into statutes or regulations. So if you're in an accounting firm, for example, it may be unethical to cheat and hide the numbers, but it's also potentially illegal. You need to, at a minimum, in terms of your ethical commitment, comply with the law, because there could be either fines or maybe even imprisonment for personal abuse of those laws. The ethical component of corporate social responsibility is just to do more than is legally mandated and act like a good citizen. Just because it's an organization as opposed to an individual doesn't mean that it shouldn't be operating to satisfy the ethical norms that society would believe is due. If you act in an unethical nature and you get publicized because of it, it could have an impact on your bottom line, because people would not be inclined to necessarily work with an unethical company or a company that is perceived to be unethical. The social component of corporate social responsibility kind of goes to the whole idea that if you're a good corporate citizen, you're going to be doing good for society. It goes beyond even being legal or ethical, but you're actively trying to improve the society in which you are operating. A lot of companies will make donations to charities. Honestly, a lot of companies will make advertisements, making sure people know about those donations, but they want to be perceived as acting in a way that's going to be beneficial to society, more than just simply complying with the law or being an ethical player. So that concludes Chapter 7. We'll do videos for Chapters 11 and 12 to make up for the classes that were missed because of the COVID pandemic.